The sun was sinking low over the dusty plains of Arizona, painting the sky in deep streaks of gold and red. The small town of Red River was bustling that evening. Wagons creaked, horses snorted, and the smell of fried cornmeal drifted from the saloon. It was auction day at the old Peterson farm, and half the town had gathered to see what old farmer Peterson was selling before leaving for California. Among the cattle, tools, and farm goods, one strange rumor had spread like wildfire. Peterson was offering something unthinkable: buy a cow, get a working Apache woman for free. People whispered, some with laughter, some with disgust, and others with greedy eyes. She stood by the corral, tied with a rough rope at her wrists, a young Apache woman, her hair black as midnight, her eyes steady and cold. The people gathered around, murmuring, staring. Some saw her as a prize, others as a burden. Peterson stood beside her, his red face glistening with sweat, shouting over the noise. He claimed she had been captured months ago after a raid on the outskirts of town, taken in to work off her debt for stealing a horse. But everyone knew how such stories went. She wasn't there by choice. Strong worker, can milk, clean, even herd, Peterson shouted. You buy one of my cows and this Apache gal goes with it. Free labor, folks. The crowd roared with laughter, the echo rolling over the dry fields, and then he appeared. From the far end of the road, a lone rider approached. His hat was pulled low, his long duster coat catching the last rays of sunset. His horse was a proud black stallion, its hooves kicking up dust. The laughter quieted as he drew closer, and only the wind dared whisper through the silence. They called him Caleb Hunter, a name carried in hushed tones across the frontier. Some said he was a gunslinger who'd walked away from a life of killing. Others claimed he was a rancher now, living alone in the high mesas, far from trouble. No one really knew, but everyone knew not to cross him. Caleb dismounted without a word, his boots crunching against the dry dirt. His eyes moved over the crowd, then stopped on the Apache woman. For a long moment, the two looked at each other, one bound and silent, the other unreadable as stone. Peterson called out, forcing a grin. Hunter, you here to buy some cattle? Got a deal no man can refuse. Cow comes with company. Caleb's gaze didn't waver. He studied the rope around the woman's wrists, the bruises faint on her arms, the way she held her chin high despite the stares. No one spoke. The moment stretched until Peterson cleared his throat and raised his hands. All right then, let's start the bidding. $10 for the cow and the Apache woman comes along, free of charge. Laughter rippled again, but Caleb didn't move. He simply walked closer, his spurs ringing softly. Then he stopped, standing between Peterson and the woman. The farmer tried to keep his grin, but unease flickered in his eyes. The wind blew harder, tugging at the woman's hair. She didn't look away. Caleb's hand went to his coat pocket. He pulled out a few folded bills and laid them on the fence post beside the farmer. I'll take the cow, he said quietly. Peterson exhaled in relief. Fine choice, Hunter. That one's the best milker of the bunch. Caleb's voice cut through. And I'll take the woman, but not as a giveaway. A ripple went through the crowd. Peterson blinked. Now hold on, that ain't how the deal. Caleb's eyes lifted, cold and certain. How much? The farmer swallowed, sensing the danger. She ain't worth. Caleb's voice sharpened. I didn't ask what she's worth. I asked how much. A tense silence settled over the farm. A dog barked in the distance. Finally, Peterson muttered a number, higher than anyone expected. Caleb counted the bills, added more, and dropped them in the dust at the man's feet. Cut her loose, he said. Peterson hesitated, but under Caleb's stare, he obeyed. The rope fell, and for the first time in months, the woman's wrists were free. She rubbed them slowly, her eyes fixed on the man before her. The crowd was silent now. No more laughter, no more jokes. They watched as Caleb untied the cow, took its lead rope, and started walking toward his horse. The woman followed, though he hadn't said a word to her. Behind them, Peterson muttered curses, scooping up the money, but even he didn't dare speak too loudly. The people parted as the cowboy and the Apache woman passed, their footsteps the only sound in the gathering dusk. As they reached the edge of the property, the woman stopped and looked back once, not at the town but at the setting sun over the hills. Then she turned, following Caleb down the road, away from the laughter, away from the rope, into the unknown. The wind carried the dust around them like a veil, and for the first time that day the plains were quiet. But the story of that auction, of the man who bought freedom instead of cattle, would echo through Red River for years to come. That night, as they rode in silence under a rising moon, Caleb knew one thing for certain. He hadn't just bought a cow. He had stepped into something far deeper, something that would change both their lives forever. The trail wound through the hills like a faded scar, half swallowed by the dust and weeds of the late summer heat. Caleb Hunter rode slow, the reins loose in his hand, the black stallion pacing steady beneath him. Behind, the newly bought cow trudged along, lowing softly now and then. And beside it, silent as a shadow, walked the Apache woman. She hadn't said a word since they left the Peterson farm, not one sound, not even when the sky burned red over the mesa, or when the chill crept in as the stars came out. She moved like someone born to the land, sure-footed, unshaken, and distant as the wind itself. Caleb didn't ask her name. He didn't ask where she came from, or what had brought her into Peterson's hands. In truth, he didn't know what to say. He had seen cruelty before, men broken, lives traded like cattle, and he knew better than to open old wounds before the scars were ready. They reached a small creek by midnight. Caleb dismounted, tethered the cow, and started a small fire. The woman watched from a distance, standing still, her eyes unreadable. He slid his saddle off, fed the horse a handful of oats, and finally sat down beside the flames. The silence between them was heavy, broken only by the cracking of wood and the quiet murmur of water nearby. She didn't come closer, but she didn't wander off either. She simply crouched a few yards away, wrapping her arms around her knees, staring at the firelight flickering against the trees. The rope marks on her wrists caught the glow, red, raw, and ugly. For the first time, Caleb saw the depth of her weariness. Her hair was tangled, her face streaked with dust, but her posture was proud. This wasn't a beaten woman. This was someone who had endured. When dawn broke, the fire had burned to embers and the world was awash in gold. Caleb packed his gear, poured some water into a tin cup, and left it near her before saddling his horse. She didn't move until he was ready to go. Then, without a word, she rose and followed again. Not because he told her to, but because something wordless bound them on that lonely road. The days that followed were quiet. They traveled west, through long stretches of desert and patches of scrubland. Caleb's small ranch lay beyond the Red Ridge, a forgotten patch of earth where few men cared to wander. On the third day, as they crossed a dry wash, the cow stumbled and fell. Caleb stopped to help, his boots sinking in the soft dirt. As he worked, the woman stepped forward suddenly, surprising him. She crouched beside the animal, whispering something under her breath, soft, rhythmic sounds in her native tongue. Her hands were steady, gentle, her touch sure. Together they lifted the cow and coaxed it back onto its feet. Caleb stood aside, watching as the woman led it forward, guiding it with a firm yet calm presence. It was the first time he saw her truly alive, moving with purpose, with strength. For a fleeting second, she looked back at him, her expression unreadable, then turned away again. That night, they reached the ridge overlooking his land. Below lay a small cabin, a corral, and a stretch of grass that shimmered pale in the moonlight. The wind carried the faint scent of sage and rain. Caleb felt the old ache of solitude stir in his chest. He had built this place years ago to escape the noise of men, the endless killing that had marked his younger life. It had been quiet here, too quiet. Now there was another soul in that silence. He showed her the cabin when morning came. Inside there were only the bare essentials, a cot, a stove, some shelves. He motioned toward the corner where a small basin stood and stepped outside to tend to the animals. When he returned, hours later, the cabin was transformed. The dust had been swept out, the blankets cleaned, and the smell of boiling herbs filled the air. The woman was tending a pot near the stove, her back turned. It struck him then, the strange sense of peace her presence brought. She hadn't spoken a word, but she worked with quiet rhythm, as though she had lived there all her life. In the days that followed, the routine settled naturally. Caleb worked the fields, repaired fences, and cared for the horses. The woman, who still refused to speak, milked the cow, fetched water, and cooked. At night she sat near the fire outside, gazing at the stars. He caught himself watching her sometimes, trying to read the language of her silence. There was something haunted in her eyes, something that spoke of loss and pain but also resilience. Once, while fixing the corral gate, he noticed her standing near the edge of the pasture, staring at the horizon. The wind tugged at her hair, carrying the faint hum of a melody. It wasn't quite a song, more like a memory turned into sound. It was the first time he heard her voice, soft, low, and almost sorrowful. He didn't interrupt. He just listened, pretending to work while the sound faded with the wind. That night, as the fire flickered and the coyotes howled in the distance, he thought about the woman, about the cruel trade that had brought her into his path. He didn't know her story, but he could feel the weight of it pressing between every silent glance. Days turned into weeks, and though she still didn't speak, the air between them began to shift. Trust grew, slow but steady, like a fragile sprout breaking through dry soil. But beyond the ridge, rumors still traveled faster than the wind. Word of the auction, of the cowboy who bought an Apache woman, had reached ears that weren't kind. One evening, as the sky turned the color of blood, a lone rider appeared on the far ridge. He sat watching the cabin for a long while before turning his horse and disappearing into the dust. Caleb didn't see him, but the woman did. Her eyes followed that distant figure, her body tense, her silence suddenly different. Heavier, alert, something from her past was stirring, and she knew it was only a matter of time before it came for her. The peace they had found in the wilderness would not last forever. The days that followed were quieter than ever. The ranch lay cradled between the ridges, hidden from the main trails and far from the noise of the town. Caleb Hunter rose before sunrise each morning, tending the fields, repairing fences, and training his horses. The Apache woman, still silent, worked alongside him, her movements calm and certain. The air between them had grown familiar, unspoken trust built out of routine, survival, and shared solitude. The first signs of autumn had begun to touch the land. The grass turned brittle underfoot, and the air carried the faint chill of coming storms. The sky was endless, and the world around them felt unchanged. Yet something beneath that peace had shifted. Caleb could feel it in the stillness of the nights. The woman no longer sang by the fire. She no longer looked at the stars as she once did. Instead, her gaze often lingered on the dark horizon, as if searching for something unseen. Sometimes she would startle at small sounds, the snap of a branch, the call of a hawk, and though she said nothing, her fear hung heavy in the air. Caleb noticed, but he didn't press. He had learned long ago that some pains could not be dragged into the open. They had to surface on their own, in their own time. One evening, as the last light faded behind the hills, he saw smoke in the far distance. It rose thin and gray, too controlled to be wildfire. He studied it for a long moment before turning away. Smoke meant riders. Riders meant trouble. By the next morning the woman was gone. The door to the cabin hung open, and her small bundle of belongings, a folded blanket, a clay trinket, and a length of woven cloth, had vanished. Her tracks led down toward the creek, then turned west toward the old hunting trail that ran along the canyon rim. Caleb saddled his horse and followed. The trail was faint, and the wind had begun to erase her footprints, but he found signs of her passage: broken twigs, displaced stones, a single handprint in the dust near a cluster of mesquite trees. She had been moving quickly, too quickly for someone trying to vanish quietly. As he rode, the world grew harsher. The air thickened with heat, the rocks turned red, and the silence pressed close. He came upon her tracks again near the canyon bend, and beside them, another set. Horses. 3 of them. His chest tightened. Whoever had been watching from the ridge had found her. Caleb spurred his horse forward, his mind clear, his body steady with purpose. The canyon narrowed into a dry riverbed, the walls rising steep and jagged. He followed the marks of hooves and scuffle, the signs of struggle scattered along the sand, a torn piece of fabric, a few drops of blood, and a rope imprint in the dirt. He didn't call out. There was no point in shouting into the wind. The trail ended near an old mining shack, long abandoned. He dismounted and approached on foot, every movement silent, practiced. From inside came the muffled sounds of movement, then the crack of a whip, followed by laughter, hard, cruel laughter that carried across the dry stone. Caleb stood still for a long moment, his jaw tight. Then he moved. When the echoes faded, the canyon was quiet again. A lone figure emerged from the shadows, dusty, tired but unhurt. Behind her the shack burned, its flames licking at the night, swallowing the remnants of cruelty. The woman stood beside Caleb, her face streaked with ash and tears but her eyes clear. They rode back in silence under the pale light of the moon. She didn't thank him, and he didn't ask where she had gone or why she had run. The only sound was the rhythmic beat of the horse's hooves against the earth. Back at the ranch, she went to the creek, washing away the dust and blood from her skin. When she returned, her old clothes were gone, burned with the others, and she wore one of Caleb's spare shirts, too large for her frame. For the first time since he had met her, she looked directly into his eyes and nodded once. It wasn't gratitude, it was acknowledgement, a silent understanding that whatever had been chasing her was finished, for now, but something in her gaze told him that her story was far from over. That night, the wind picked up, howling through the valley. Caleb sat by the fire outside, staring into the flames, while the woman remained inside the cabin, seated near the window. He could see her silhouette framed in the glow of the lamp, motionless, distant, almost fragile. He wondered what horrors she had endured before Peterson's farm, what life she had been taken from, and how she had survived it all without a word. The fire crackled, and he found himself thinking of the way she had faced those men, defiant, unyielding, like a wild creature refusing to die. The next morning, she began marking something on the cabin wall, lines and symbols drawn carefully with charcoal. Caleb didn't understand them, but they looked like parts of a map, or perhaps a memory she was trying to preserve. She spent hours at it, lost in thought, her hands steady, her expression calm. Slowly, color began to return to her face. She spoke once, to the cow, softly in her language. It wasn't much, just a few murmured words, but to Caleb, it was enough. It meant she had not completely surrendered to silence. The ranch changed in small ways after that. Flowers began to appear near the door, stones arranged in patterns beside the creek. The woman moved with purpose again, and though her voice remained rare, her presence began to fill the space like sunlight through a dusty window. Yet, even as life returned to the ranch, shadows still lingered beyond the ridge. Caleb had seen the tracks of horses again near the northern boundary. Different ones this time, heavier, fresher. He told himself they were passing travelers, prospectors maybe, but deep down he knew better. The West had a way of never leaving things buried for long, and though the fire of that canyon had burned the ghosts of the men who came for her, it had also sent up a signal, a trail of smoke that someone, somewhere, might have seen. As the season began to change, so did the feeling in the air. The woman no longer looked afraid, but she no longer looked free either. It was as if she knew what was coming, and Caleb could feel it too. The peace of the ranch was only the calm before another storm, one that neither of them could escape. The first winter wind came early that year, sweeping through the canyons and across the open plains with a whisper that carried warning. The air grew sharp, the sky heavy with steel-gray clouds, and the earth began to harden under frost. On the high ridge above Caleb Hunter's ranch, snow gathered in the cracks of rock, white and silent. Down below, life continued in steady rhythm. The cow was heavy with calf now, grazing near the creek where water still ran thin but clear. The Apache woman worked from dawn until dusk, preparing the cabin for the coming cold, stacking wood, patching the roof, and drying herbs she gathered in secret places. Her silence had softened over the months. She spoke little, but when she did, it was with quiet certainty, her voice low and even, like the murmur of distant thunder. Caleb had grown used to her presence, the sound of her footsteps outside, the faint scent of smoke and wild sage that lingered wherever she went. He didn't ask her to explain the symbols she drew or the prayers she whispered at sunset. Some things didn't need to be understood to be respected. But beneath that calm surface, both of them felt the same unease. It began with hoofprints near the far end of the pasture, deep, fresh, and unfamiliar. Caleb found them one morning after a night of restless sleep. The tracks led down from the ridge, crossed the creek, and vanished into the brush. Whoever had made them had ridden close, too close, before turning back. He didn't mention it to her, but she knew. Her eyes followed the ridges each day as she worked, scanning the horizon for movement. Her silence grew heavier again, her body tense, her steps cautious. The peace they had built now felt fragile, like thin ice waiting to break. 2 days later, the rider came. It was just past noon when Caleb heard the sound of hooves, slow, deliberate, carrying the weight of a man who knew how to ride without fear. The figure appeared from the north trail, dust rising behind him in a pale cloud. His coat was long and dark, his hat pulled low. Even from a distance there was something about the way he sat his horse, straight, proud, dangerous. Caleb stepped out from the barn, his rifle resting across his arm, and waited. The stranger stopped a few paces away, his eyes hidden in shadow. For a long moment neither moved. The air was still save for the steady breathing of horses and the creak of leather. The stranger finally dismounted, slow and controlled. He tied his horse to the fence and walked closer, his spurs ringing softly on the frozen ground. He looked around, the cabin, the corral, the cow grazing quietly by the water. And then his gaze found the woman. She had stepped out of the cabin, a bundle of wood in her arms. When she saw him, the wood slipped from her grasp and scattered at her feet. Her face went pale as dust. The stranger smiled, not with warmth, but with recognition. Caleb didn't need words to understand. The past she had fled had just ridden up to their door. The man spoke briefly, but Caleb barely listened. It wasn't the voice that mattered. It was the look in his eyes, cold and hungry. He didn't come for business. He came for claim. The kind of claim men made when they thought others less than human, whatever name the Apache woman once had. Whatever story had led her to Peterson's farm, this man was part of it. Caleb could see it in the way she trembled, not from fear alone, but from the weight of memory. The wind picked up, scattering dust and straw between them. The stranger's hand rested near his holster, not drawn yet, but close enough to make his meaning clear. Caleb stood still, his face unreadable, his rifle steady but low. The woman took a step back toward the cabin, her eyes never leaving the man. For the first time since she had come to the ranch, her mask of silence broke. A sound escaped her, half gasp, half cry, something primal and filled with old pain. Then everything happened at once. The stranger's hand moved. Caleb's rifle came up. The echo of gunfire cracked across the valley like thunder. When the smoke cleared, the rider lay in the dirt, his body still. The horse bolted into the open plains, its reins trailing behind. The only sound was the ringing in Caleb's ears and the sharp wind cutting through the silence. The woman stood frozen by the cabin door. Her hands shook, her breath ragged, but her eyes were steady. She looked at the man on the ground for a long time before turning away. She didn't cry, she didn't speak. She simply went inside and closed the door behind her. Caleb buried the body the next morning beyond the creek, marking the grave with a single stone. He didn't know the man's name, and he didn't care to learn it. When he returned, the woman was sitting by the fire, a small clay jar in her hands. She placed it on the table and gestured toward it, then toward the door. Inside the jar was ash, the remains of something she had burned, perhaps a token of the past, perhaps a farewell. That night, she lit a fire outside and stood by it, her face illuminated by the glow. She raised her arms toward the stars and began to speak in her language, slow, rhythmic, like a prayer carried by the wind. The words were strange to Caleb's ear, but their meaning was clear enough. It was not grief she spoke, but release. When she finished, she turned and looked at him for a long time. Her eyes were different now, calmer, older, and heavy with something he couldn't name. The next morning she began to work again as if nothing had happened. But the silence between them was no longer hollow. It was a silence filled with understanding, built not on fear but on choice. Caleb knew that whatever bond had formed between them was now sealed, not by words, not by promise, but by what they had faced together. Yet far away, in the dusty streets of Red River, word of the dead man began to spread. A rider found his horse wandering the plains, and before long, talk reached the saloon. A cowboy had killed one of the Lyman brothers, the same Lymans known for their ruthless dealings in stolen land and people. And when the Lymans rode for vengeance, they didn't come alone. By the time winter settled fully on the land, dark clouds gathered again, not of weather, but of blood. The woman had found peace for a moment, but the past was not finished with either of them. Their quiet world on the ridge was about to be tested by the storm of men who believed they could own anything, even souls. The sun rose cold and colorless over the red ridge, frost clung to the fence rails, and the earth cracked beneath the weight of the morning chill. The land looked peaceful, but beneath that stillness a quiet tension began to stir, a shadow moving unseen. Caleb Hunter felt it before he saw it. There was a heaviness in the wind, the kind that carried whispers from distant places. He had lived too long on the frontier not to recognize the calm before something deadly. The woman, who had once been nothing but a stranger bound by rope, had settled into the rhythms of the ranch again. The days passed with measured silence. She tended to the cow's newborn calf, mended tools, and kept the fire burning through the long nights. Her strength had returned, though the light in her eyes carried a weight that spoke of both survival and warning. She knew what was coming. Caleb could sense it. Word from Red River traveled fast, and vengeance traveled faster. The man he had buried by the creek was not a drifter, not a nameless wanderer. He was blood to the Lyman family, ranchers by name, but killers by trade. 3 brothers and a small army of men who ruled the valleys with guns and fear. Caleb had crossed them once before, years ago, when he still carried a badge. They hadn't forgotten his face. Now they had a reason to come looking. By the 3rd morning, tracks appeared near the ridge. 5 horses, then 7, then more. Caleb spent the afternoon moving quietly across his land, closing gates, gathering supplies, and checking his rifle. The woman watched from the doorway of the cabin, her face unreadable. She didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. The silence between them said enough. That night, the wind howled across the plains, shaking the cabin walls. Inside, the fire burned low, and shadows flickered across their faces. Caleb sat near the window, his rifle across his knees, eyes fixed on the distant line of the horizon. The woman sat by the fire, her hands weaving something from rawhide and cloth, a small pouch, simple but deliberate. When she finished, she placed it on the table beside him. It was an Apache charm, woven for protection, for courage in the face of death. Caleb said nothing, but he understood the meaning. The first shot came just after dawn. It echoed across the valley, sharp and cruel. The horses screamed from the corral, and the cow bolted toward the trees. Caleb was already on his feet before the sound faded. He stepped outside, scanning the ridges. In the far distance, a flicker of movement caught the light. Men on horseback, descending the slope like a tide of dust and hate. The Lymans had come. The attack began with fire. Flames roared through the grass near the western fence, smoke rising thick into the morning air. The smell of burning wood mixed with the stench of gunpowder. Caleb moved quickly, leading the woman toward the creek. He knew they couldn't hold the cabin. It would be a death trap once the fire reached it. He set her behind the rocks, signaling her to stay low, and turned back toward the barn. There was no room for fear in his movements, only instinct and precision. The rifle cracked once, twice, 3 times. 2 riders fell before the rest even reached the field. But they kept coming. The woman crouched by the creek, clutching the charm she had made. She watched as the smoke swallowed the cabin, as fire devoured the walls she had mended and the roof she had repaired. Every plank, every memory of peace burned in orange light against the rising sun. Yet through the chaos she saw Caleb, moving like a shadow, calm amid the storm. The man who had once bought her freedom now fighting for both of theirs. The battle raged for hours. The Lymans shouted curses across the field, their bullets tearing through the trees. Caleb moved from cover to cover, using every inch of the land he knew so well. He fought with the patience of a hunter, not the recklessness of a desperate man. By midday the field was littered with smoke and silence. Only the crackle of fire and the cry of a wounded horse broke the still air. Caleb's coat was torn, his arm bleeding, but his stance remained steady. The Lyman riders had retreated, for now. The woman approached him slowly, her steps soft on the scorched earth. She carried water from the creek in a tin bowl and tore a strip of cloth from her skirt to bind his wound. Her hands were sure, though her eyes glistened with something unspoken. As she worked, he watched the horizon. He knew it wasn't over. The Lymans weren't men to let pride die easily. They would return, and next time, they wouldn't come in small numbers. The woman seemed to sense the same. When night fell, she gathered what little remained unburned. A few tools, a blanket, and the Apache charm she had woven. She placed it around his wrist and met his gaze with quiet determination. She wasn't running this time. The land around them was scarred, blackened by fire, but the stars above still shone clear. In that fragile stillness, Caleb realized how much had changed. What began as an act of defiance at a cruel auction had become something deeper, a bond forged in silence, in trust, in shared survival. Yet freedom had a price, and the West always demanded payment. When the wind shifted that night, carrying with it the faint sound of distant hooves, Caleb rose from where he sat. The woman stood too, the firelight glinting in her eyes. There was no fear now, only resolve. They both knew what came next. Beyond the ridge, more riders were gathering. The Lymans were not finished, and neither was the land's hunger for blood. As the first light of dawn touched the hills once more, Caleb tightened the strap of his rifle and looked toward the horizon. The Apache woman stood beside him, her face calm, her hands steady. The war for their freedom had only begun. The dawn broke slow and pale, its light spilling across a land scarred by smoke and ruin. The ashes of the cabins still smoldered, rising in thin threads that carried the scent of loss into the morning air. The once peaceful ranch now stood silent, save for the creak of charred timbers and the distant call of a hawk. Caleb Hunter stood at the edge of what had been his home, his rifle slung across his back, the bandage on his arm dark with dried blood. His face was drawn, lined with fatigue, but his eyes held the same steady resolve that had seen him through every storm before. Beside him stood the Apache woman, no longer a captive, no longer a servant, but something far stronger. Her clothes were torn and singed, her hair streaked with soot, yet her bearing was proud. The land had tried to break her many times before, but still she endured. They had survived the first assault, but both knew it was only the beginning. The Lyman brothers had suffered a humiliation they would not forgive. They had buried their own beneath the trees of Red Ridge, and vengeance was the only language they understood. Caleb spent the morning rebuilding what he could. He fixed the corral gate, buried the bodies of the men who had fallen, and salvaged ammunition from the wreckage. Every movement was deliberate, a man preparing not just for battle, but for closure. The woman worked silently beside him, tending to the horses, gathering herbs for healing, and drawing strange symbols in the dirt near the fire. They were marks of her people, symbols of courage, of balance, of guidance. The wind whispered through them as though listening. By mid-afternoon, dark clouds began to gather in the distance. The wind grew stronger, pushing against the valley. Caleb knew the storm that brewed in the sky mirrored the one about to descend upon them. As the sun dipped low, the sound of hooves returned, slow at first, then building into a steady thunder that rolled across the plains. From the ridge came the Lyman brothers, and nearly a dozen riders, each armed, each burning with the kind of rage that left no room for mercy. They came with fire, with ropes, with rifles gleaming in the dying light. Caleb led the Apache woman toward the line of rocks near the creek, the same ground that had shielded them before, but this time, there would be no retreat. He had made peace with that. The West was not kind to those who ran, it respected only those who stood their ground. The battle began as the last of the sun slipped below the hills. Gunfire cracked through the dusk, and smoke mingled with the rising wind. The Lymans fanned out, circling like wolves, their shouts echoing across the valley. Caleb moved with precision, his rifle steady, each shot finding its mark. The woman moved beside him, swift and silent, her bow in hand, a weapon of her ancestors. She fought with the grace of the wind, her arrows cutting through the smoke like whispers of vengeance. They were outnumbered but not outmatched. As the storm finally broke overhead, lightning split the sky, illuminating the chaos below. The rain came hard and fast, washing blood into the earth, turning dust into mud. Caleb's world narrowed to flashes of light, the roar of thunder, and the steady rhythm of his heart. One by one, the Lyman men fell, until only the brothers remained, 3 figures standing in the downpour, their faces twisted with hate. They dismounted, advancing through the rain with knives drawn, their boots sinking into the soaked ground. Caleb's rifle was empty. He drew his revolver instead, steady despite the wound reopening on his arm. The woman, too, had only one arrow left. They exchanged no words, no looks, only understanding. The first brother fell to her arrow before he reached them. The second lunged at Caleb, and they went down hard into the mud. The fight was brutal and close, every movement a struggle between life and death. Caleb's strength began to falter, but the fire in his spirit did not. With a final surge, he broke free and ended it. The last brother stood apart, his weapon trembling in his hands. The rain poured over his face, washing away the grime and fury until only fear remained. For a moment it seemed he might turn and flee, but pride wouldn't let him. He raised his gun. The Apache woman moved faster. Her knife flashed through the rain, and the echo of his fall was swallowed by thunder. When the storm passed, silence returned, deep, heavy, and final. The rain softened to a whisper. The smoke cleared, and the land breathed again. Caleb stood in the aftermath, chest heaving, his hands slick with rain and blood. The woman approached him slowly, her steps light on the wet ground. Her gaze lingered on the horizon, where the first faint trace of dawn began to rise. For the first time there was peace in her expression. Not the fragile peace of surrender, but the quiet strength of freedom won. Caleb looked toward the burned cabin and the ruined field. Everything he had built was gone, yet somehow he felt more whole than he had in years. The land had taken everything from him, but it had given him something far greater, a reason to fight, and someone to fight for. Days later, when the smoke finally cleared from the valley, the two of them rode away together. They left behind the ashes and the ghosts of what had been, following the river north toward the open plains. There were no words between them, only the rhythm of hooves and the wind brushing through the tall grass. The world stretched wide before them, endless, wild, and waiting. In time, people would tell the story of that ranch, of the farmer who tried to sell a woman's freedom, and of the cowboy who defied the cruelty of the West to stand for what was right. Some would call it legend, others would say it never happened. But somewhere beyond the Red Ridge, beneath the same sky that had once burned with fire and thunder, a man and a woman carved a life out of the wilderness, a life not born of ownership or pity, but of survival, of trust, and of something like love. The land would remember them, even when the names were lost to time. The ashes of the past would feed new grass, and the story would live on in whispers carried by the wind. And when the wind howled through the empty plains, the people would say it was the spirit of the Apache woman and the cowboy who chose freedom over fear, riding together forever through the endless West.